Looks like you can't come out anymore. Amidst the scorching heat of midsummer, I was asked by Rose, my husband's mother, to clean up the shed in the garden. Although it should have been new, when I peered inside the shed, I found various items scattered around like health equipment my Rose had bought, and old cat toys that were no longer used. I had just left the house with Bob to buy tools for organizing the items inside, when we heard Rose's voice coming from the garden. With a smirk on her face, as if plotting something, Rose locked the empty shed and then forcefully hurled the key she was holding into the river right next to our house, which flowed by. The river, which usually had a gentle flow with its riverbed visible, was just trickling along. However, today was different due to a sudden heavy rain, resulting in an exceptionally rare and raging current. If she were to toss the shed key into such a river, finding the small key would be impossible. Of course, it would become impossible to open the shed. It should have been clear to anyone, but Rose perhaps didn't even realize such a simple fact. As a result, she had unwittingly made it impossible to help an important presence. My name is Lucy Mackenzie. My encounter with my husband happened at a marriage-seeking party. Having crossed the age of 40, I had already given up on the idea of marriage, thinking it was too late for me. Even so, unable to ignore my persistent parents' pleas, I reluctantly decided to join the marriage-seeking party, even though I found it troublesome. The event I attended was a gathering of slightly older men and women, targeted towards a more mature age group. The party was attended by people who were, like me, contemplating whether marriage was still a viable option, as well as those who hadn't given up on the idea of marriage and were still actively seeking it. Even though the event was centered around the premise of marriage, the presence of parents added a slightly awkward dimension. As the party kicked off, various activities were organized, and the venue began to buzz with excitement. Unable to blend into such an atmosphere, I retreated to a corner of the venue and started drinking alone. Just then, a man who seemed to be similarly struggling to fit in with the party's atmosphere approached me. This man turned out to be Bob, who would later become my husband. Initially, our interaction was limited to formal greetings, but as time passed, we discovered shared interests that led to engaging conversations. We lost track of time and had such an enjoyable time together. The topic that sparked the most enthusiasm in our conversation with Bob was our mutual love for animals, especially cats. The shared experience of having cats as pets back home became a strong connection that bridged the gap between us. After the party ended, we exchanged brief greetings with each other's parents. However, at that moment, Rose didn't seem very pleased when she looked at me. I assumed that she was probably just observing the type of woman who might become her daughter-in-law, so I didn't pay it much attention. Our relationship progressed smoothly, and eventually, we decided to get married. However, when we made this decision, Rose came up with the idea. Well, in that case, wouldn't it be better for us to live together? So, my husband's parents had their house with a garden remodeled into a two-family home, and we ended up living together. The reason for living together was that Rose wasn't skilled at household chores, so she probably wanted to offload all the household responsibilities onto me. I recognized this, but since I was adept at housework, it didn't bother me much. Subsequently, there were times when we struggled with the inability to have children. However, Bob's kindness and care for me helped us navigate through those moments, allowing us to live our lives without significant worry. Even though I've been living with my husband's parents, there's something that has been bothering me. It's Rose's soliloquies. Rose's soliloquies aren't your typical, everyday mutterings. They're louder than usual for mere soliloquies, and they often carry a hint of subtle sarcasm in their content. Even Bob understands that Rose's soliloquies are just her usual behavior. Here we go again. Sighing and feeling exasperated with the situation, we were both troubled by Rose's soliloquies. But as time passed and we continued living together, these soliloquies gradually transformed into something more than just casual mutterings. After several months of living together, Rose suddenly started addressing a cat she was holding in her arms. "I'd like to see the face of my grandchild too," in an audible voice. It was a deliberate soliloquy that sounded quite contrived. When I questioned my Rose, who seemed to be talking to herself, she responded, "Oh, Lucy, were you there? By the way, did you know? The Anderson family next door is expecting a great-grandchild soon." While creating an atmosphere as if she hadn't noticed me, she began discussing how it's envy-worthy when acquaintances have grandchildren or great-grandchildren born into their families. After that, Rose started almost every day addressing the cat, but in a way that was clearly meant for me to hear. She would say things like, "I wonder when you'll have a child?" in a loud voice that wasn't a mere soliloquy but seemed more like a repetitive catchphrase. The words that transitioned from soliloquies to catchphrases for Rose became particularly pronounced when Brown and Bob were not around. She would say things like, "I wonder about a wife who can't have children," while holding the cat and looking directly at me. One day, when our cat Tater returned home, she seemed unwell and was looking quite lethargic. In a rush, I took Tater to the animal hospital, where I learned that she was pregnant. After bringing Tater back home, I informed everyone that she wasn't sick. Afterward, I asked why we hadn't opted for neutering, considering she was a pet cat. "But, you know, it's just so sad to hurt her body, or change it in any way." From Rose's perspective, the repetitive sarcasm directed at me, which had become her catchphrase, probably didn't seem like something she should feel sorry for. I understand the desire to care for cats, but for indoor cats, it's important to keep them indoors, ensure they are neutered, and take preventive measures such as vaccinations against infections and diseases. Regular health management is crucial. The cats at my parents' house have never skipped essential health measures like neutering, as well as annual vaccinations and other disease preventive measures. I was surprised to learn that Tater at the Mackenzie household hadn't received such care. However, my Rose explained, "Tater should be free to live her life as she wants, so I've never made her do anything she dislikes." In essence, Rose had intentionally refrained from making her undergo these procedures. Several weeks passed, and Tater gave birth safely. As I was being charmed by the adorable newborn kittens, Rose noticed them and commented, "Even though the cute and clever Tater has given birth to so many kittens, it's quite odd that Lucy hasn't had a single child. Something must be wrong, don't you think?" After that, Rose's life seemed to revolve around nothing more than gazing at the cats without any particular purpose. Originally, I was the one responsible for all the household chores at the Mackenzie household. However, Rose gradually began delegating even the smallest tasks related to the cats, such as feeding them and taking care of their litter boxes, to me. Even when I told Rose that I wanted to help out a bit for the cute cats, she only glared at me and said, "These are my daughter and grandchild. They have a much brighter future than someone like you," and just continued to stare at me. Afterwards, when the kittens became able to move around on their own, she said, "Why are you even in this house? You're lower than an animal that can't even give birth to children, so worship our cat lords." She even tried to make the cats kneel down in front of her. I couldn't understand Rose's inexplicable attitude. "Yes, I understand. I apologize for my shortcomings," I responded, trying to handle the harassment with a light touch. Rose, displeased with my attitude, started using my bowl for cat food and made the cats scratch on my favorite bag, as if to teach me a lesson. On a scorching hot day, as I was bothered by the overgrown weeds, I was doing some weeding in the garden when Rose, surprisingly, approached me and started talking. "Come to think of it, could you tidy up the contents of the warehouse over there?" Rose asked, and as I opened the door of the new shed that had been placed in the garden, I found a pile of unused fitness equipment haphazardly stacked inside. Upon closer inspection, there were also many broken cat toys that seemed to have been used in the past, left abandoned among the items. succeed in finishing it today, please, she said and then went off somewhere. Surely, it must mean that since Brown is returning home late today, I should have it done before he comes back. However, the items inside the warehouse were quite numerous, and it was impossible to finish in just one day. Rose must have known this when she asked me to do it. I took the items that had been haphazardly packed inside the warehouse out to the open space, but as expected, the quantity was impossible to finish easily. At that point, I decided to seek help from Bob. I have some time right now, so I'll head over there right away. Bob, who readily agreed to help, didn't seem to anticipate that the contents of the garden shed would be in such a terrible state. Giving up on the idea of sorting things out easily, we decided to follow Bob's suggestion. We headed to the home improvement store to buy tools for cleaning up the inside of the warehouse. Just before getting into the car driven by my husband, I heard Rose's voice coming from the garden. Looks like you can't come out anymore. At that moment, I didn't understand what Rose was talking about. Thinking it was probably just her usual muttering, I decided not to pay it any mind and went shopping without worrying about it. When we arrived at the home improvement store, Bob was enthusiastic about remodeling the inside of the warehouse. Although we had been told that it would be best to finish cleaning up before Brown returned, Bob was loading items onto the shopping cart one after another. In addition to shelves like the colored boxes, Bob's meticulous shopping included boards and lumber. There were more items than anticipated, and it took longer than planned. Not only did we fill up the trunk of the car, but we also used the rear seats to accommodate the numerous tools we bought. As we returned home, we could hear Rose's voice coming from inside the house. Tater! Tater! Where are you? As I opened the front door, Rose looked at me with a puzzled expression on her face. I'm back now. Rose? Is something the matter? I tried speaking to her, but Rose just stared at me with a gaze as if she were seeing a ghost. She didn't say anything in response. What's the matter? When I asked again, Rose responded with a bewildering answer. You! Why are you here? I explained that I had gone shopping with Bob to clean up the contents of the warehouse. However, Rose, for some reason finding it puzzling, still seemed unable to grasp the situation. After pondering for a moment with a troubled expression, she asked with a skeptical look. I remember locking the door properly, so why are you? Who should be inside, here? There's no way you could have gotten outside, she said, and suddenly stared at me, fixing her gaze intensely. What are you talking about? Rose, with a look that indicated she didn't understand my question, kept repeating the same sort of thing over and over again. This is strange. I locked the warehouse door, so there's no way you could have gone outside. No matter how you look at it, the one who is acting strangely is clearly Rose. Bob and I went to check the warehouse together, and to our surprise, the door to the warehouse, which should have been open before we left, was now closed. And when I listened carefully inside the locked warehouse, I could faintly hear some sounds. Meow, meow. As I strained ears, I could hear the meowing of a cat and the scratching sound of a door coming from inside the warehouse. Hey! There's a cat trapped in there! When Bob shouted loudly, Rose, her face turning pale, rushed out into the yard in a state of panic. The warehouse door was locked and wouldn't open. Bob tried various things to remove the door, but there was no way the newly purchased warehouse door would come off easily. Mom, where's the key to the warehouse? As Bob panicked, he shouted to Rose. Rose doesn't respond properly, and no answer comes back. Desperately searching for a way to open the warehouse, I looked around. And then I realized that Rose, who was struggling to speak, had been staring at the river that flowed alongside the house all this time. This small river right next to the house usually had just a small trickle of water flowing, often revealing the riverbed. However, today was an exception. Due to the recent spades of sudden heavy rain caused by the heat, the water level had risen dramatically. The usually calm stream had turned into a rapid torrent of gray water carrying debris and sediment from the mountains.
Rose, did you throw the warehouse key into that river?
I asked, and Rose, trembling, nodded slightly in response. If she had thrown a small key into such a raging river, it would be impossible to find it now. Without the key, there was no way to open the warehouse immediately.
Why would you do something like that? Rose! Don't you have a spare key?
My panicked Rose was pulling out items one by one from the living room shelves and turning them over. At this rate, even if a spare key was found, it might get lost again in the cluttered room, becoming even harder to find.
There's no other choice but to break open the warehouse.
Bob, struck by an idea from my words, drove off somewhere and returned with a large crowbar. As Bob forcefully broke open the door and peered inside, there lay a cat that had become limp and motionless, seemingly exhausted. Inside the now unopenable warehouse, there was Tater, the beloved cat of the Mackenzie family, trapped. Tater had been dearly cherished by everyone in the family. As the door was broken open, Rose rushed out to the yard, scooped up Tater in her arms, and burst into loud sobs. And then, surprisingly, Rose suddenly exclaimed, "Ethel.
Why? You were supposed to be in there. Return Tater. Give me back my precious daughter."
She glared at me with an intense glare, her tone forced. Bob, usually composed, also started to get angry at Rose's abnormal behavior.
"What's that supposed to mean? Isn't it your fault, Mom? First of all, you were trying to trap Lucy. Even if it was a matter of life and death, you're saying it wouldn't have been a problem if Lucy was the one trapped inside?"
Locked inside the warehouse with no windows in this scorching heat, being left alone for over 2 hours would put anyone's life in danger, let alone a human. For a small creature like a cat, the risk was even higher. However, Rose, who didn't feel guilty about what she had done, started to counter with reverse anger, as if piling on.
"It's only natural. A woman who can't bear children, who can't fulfill her duty as a daughter-in-law, is not needed," she exclaimed.
Tater might have been playing with the old toys that were placed inside the warehouse. Misinterpreting the sounds, Rose might have thought that I was working inside the warehouse. She then locked the door and proceeded to throw the key into the river. Tears streaming down her face, Rose was holding the limp cat, its eyes rolled back and froth at its mouth, in her arms. While I couldn't forgive Rose, Tater was a cat that everyone in the family cherished. I might have felt hurt by being compared to a cat, but the love for a cat was something entirely separate. Seeing Tater, who had been so endearing, finally become motionless, and knowing that I wouldn't be able to see her charming presence anymore, a wave of sadness welled up within me. Ultimately, it was Rose who caused this situation. It might be tough for Rose as well, but I was also in danger, and ultimately, a cat's life was lost. Beyond anger, there was an overwhelming sense of sorrow that couldn't be wiped away. Returning home earlier than planned, Brown rushed to the yard upon hearing the voices of people shouting.
"What on earth is going on? What happened, Mom?"
Brown asked, concerned. Rose was crying out while holding the cat in her arms. Bob was staring at Rose with an exasperated expression. Unable to comprehend Rose's side of the story, I said,
"I'm sorry, Brown. Please ask Rose about it,"
and pointed at Rose and the cat. Then, after giving me another glare, Rose tearfully conveyed the shocking incident to Brown.
"It's this woman's fault. I locked the warehouse, but she wasn't inside. Instead, Tater was trapped in there.
Rose exclaimed in tears, pointing at me. Rose's inexplicable explanation was incomprehensible to everyone present. Brown asked Rose to repeat her statement to make sure he understood correctly.
Are you suggesting that you deliberately locked the warehouse? That's right. I locked up that useless daughter-in-law, threw the key into the river, and yet, she wasn't in the warehouse. What are you going to do about it? Give me back Tater!
Rose exclaimed in anger and frustration. Understanding the general situation, Brown, with a fierce expression unlike anything we'd seen before, shouted at Rose.
What the hell are you doing in this scorching heat? Lucy might have been in serious trouble because of you.
Brown yelled, his anger evident.
Mom! This is not something a human should do. I can't stand this anymore.
Bob shouted in frustration. Bob, even more furious than Brown, was also shouting at Rose. Brown and Bob, who had never been so intensely angry before, were displaying a side we had never seen. However, Rose, who was crying out of sadness, was providing only excuses that she believed were justified, despite the anger being directed at her.
I don't care about you anymore. Do whatever you want with the cat or anything else.
Brown's frustration was evident in his words. Utterly exasperated, Brown left my sobbing Rose in the yard and went back into the house. Shortly after that, Bob took arm and led me back into the house as well. Surprisingly, the next morning, Rose was still in the yard, holding the motionless cat in her arms. And Rose kept muttering to herself, "It was my fault." Rose continued her soliloquy in a voice loud enough to be heard by the neighbors. Unable to leave things as they were, my exasperated Brown forcibly took the motionless cat from Rose's arms and pushed her into the bedroom. Since I also loved cats, I couldn't help but feel deeply sorry for Tater, who had become a victim due to Rose's selfish actions. First, I piled up some soil to create a simple small mound resembling a grave for Tater. Afterward, along with Brown and Bob, we properly held a pet funeral for Tater. Rose, without engaging in any particular activity, kept her hands clasped in front of the small makeshift grave I had prepared with just a mound of soil. In the days that followed, Rose's attitude toward me didn't change. With Tater gone, the hostility directed towards me had intensified even further. Unable to live with Rose under such circumstances, Bob had decided to move out. Knowing how I was feeling through Rose's soliloquies, Bob had apparently been thinking that it would be best to live separately from his parents and had decided to stop cohabitating. As a couple, we discussed various options for our new place, and we concluded that living near my parents' house would be the best choice. Brown, exasperated by Rose's increasingly selfish behavior, had reached his limit. He left a divorce document and the house key behind, walking away from the situation. The large house, now the residence of Rose alone, was also in her name alone. As a result, Rose had to manage everything herself. However, she had never worked and had been a full-time homemaker, so she had no income to cover the expenses like taxes and maintenance costs. Unable to receive any financial support from Brown, Rose was left to her own devices. She ended up accumulating significant debt from consumer loans to cover her living expenses. Unable to sustain living there, Rose eventually had to give up the house she had lived in for just about a year. Selling the house only cleared her debts, and Rose was left without any savings for her future. She began living alone in a nearby apartment while relying on public assistance for her livelihood. Since then, we lost contact and haven't seen each other. However, it's rumored that she's become notorious as a nuisance in the apartment complex, occupying vacant units and allowing stray cats to breed unchecked. It seems likely that such actions have led to her current situation. I've heard rumors that she might be facing eviction from the apartment complex she's been living in soon. My husband and I found a suitable second-hand property near my parents' house, and we started a new life there with the two of us and our two cats. The cats we live with now are the remaining two from the litter that Tater gave birth to. We couldn't find anyone in the neighborhood to adopt them, so they stayed with us. I cherished the two cats as if they were my own children. It seems that Bob had been preparing for independence, as he rented an office near our new home and resumed his work. I also helped Bob with his work, so the two of us managed to live comfortably together. 2 years into our new life, as we started to have a bit more stability, a long-awaited joy came into our lives. We were blessed with our first child. My parents were also very happy when I told them that their first grandchild was born. Since my husband had been in touch with his father even after leaving home, when we informed him about the birth this time and told him that his first grandchild had been born, he was overjoyed and tears welled up in his eyes. Brown, who started contacting us frequently due to the charm of his first grandchild, also mentioned that living alone now felt lonely. However, lately it seems he has gained new companions, or rather, cohabiting animals, and is enjoying this new life to the fullest. By the way, Brown actually loves dogs more than cats, and he is currently living with one dog as his companion. I used to think that getting married wasn't something I needed at this point, but now that I've been able to show my parents the face of their grandchild, I believe marrying Bob was a great decision. And I've also become more involved in the activities of the cat rescue organization, offering my cooperation. I am now surrounded by adorable children and lovely cats. I am leading a happy life with 3 children and 2 cats.